The fog that settled over San Francisco on the evening of December 4, 1959, had the quality of something deliberate, as if the city had decided to draw a curtain between itself and the rest of the world. And Frank Sinatra stood on the terrace of a rented house in Pacific Heights, with a cigarette burning down between his fingers, watching the fog move through the streets below, with the slow authority of something that owned the city, rather than merely passing through it. And he had been standing there for 20 minutes without smoking the cigarette, just holding it, because the cigarette gave his hands something to do while his mind worked through a problem that had no obvious solution, and that he had been carrying for the better part of 2 weeks without telling anyone about it, which was itself unusual because Frank Sinatra was not by temperament a man who carried things alone, was not someone who found privacy comfortable or solitude particularly useful. But this specific problem had a quality that made sharing it feel impossible, which was that the problem involved doing something genuinely good for someone who would be humiliated by knowing that it had been done. The person the problem involved was a musician named Arthur Delaney, who had played trumpet in the band that backed Frank Sinatra on a touring show in 1947, and who had been exceptional at his instrument in the specific way that session musicians are sometimes exceptional, meaning that he could play anything set in front of him with a precision and musicality that made the whole ensemble sound better than it was. And Arthur had worked steadily throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, backing various singers and recording sessions, and had built a modest but stable life in Los Angeles. And then, in 1956, Arthur had developed a tremor in his right hand that the doctors eventually diagnosed as the early stages of a neurological condition that would progress slowly, but inevitably. And by 1959, the tremor had reached the point where Arthur could no longer play professionally, could no longer hold his instrument steady through an entire performance. And the career that had sustained him for 15 years had ended not with a final performance or a farewell tour, but simply with the work stopping, with the calls no longer coming, with the slow recognition that the community of musicians who had relied on Arthur for so long had moved on to find other reliable players, because the industry did not wait for anyone and could not afford sentiment about a musician whose hands were no longer dependable. Frank Sinatra had learned about Arthur's situation through a chain of connections that moved through the musician community, the way all such information moved, from one session player to another, until it reached someone who mentioned it to someone who knew Frank Sinatra. And when Frank Sinatra heard about it, he had felt something that he did not immediately name but that manifested as a specific restlessness, a quality of unresolved attention, because Arthur Delaney was not someone Frank Sinatra had known well or maintained contact with. But Arthur had played on 3 recording sessions with Frank Sinatra in 1947 and 1948, and had been exactly the kind of musician that Frank Sinatra had always respected most, the kind who showed up prepared and played precisely what the song needed and never made the session about himself. And the idea that this man was now sitting in a Los Angeles apartment with an unusable trumpet and no income felt to Frank Sinatra like a specific kind of injustice that he could not walk away from, even though walking away from it would have been entirely defensible, since Frank Sinatra owed Arthur Delaney nothing and their professional connection was 12 years in the past, and the music industry was full of musicians in difficult circumstances, and one man could not solve all of them. The problem with simply sending Arthur money was the problem of dignity, which Frank Sinatra understood, because he had spent his entire career navigating the specific relationship between success and self-respect, had spent years learning to receive things from powerful people without feeling diminished by the receiving, and he understood that Arthur Delaney, who had been a working professional musician for 15 years and had asked nothing of anyone, would experience a direct gift of money as a confirmation of his worst understanding of his own situation, would feel not helped but pitied, and pity was the thing that proud people most needed to avoid, because pity required accepting someone else's assessment of your diminishment. What Frank Sinatra arrived at after 2 weeks of turning the problem over was a solution that required several things to happen simultaneously. The first of which was that he needed to speak with someone at Capitol Records about a project that Frank Sinatra had been genuinely considering, which was the production of an educational recording series about jazz history and performance, a project that would require research and scripting, and the kind of deep musical knowledge that could only come from someone who had been inside the music for decades. And the second of which was that he needed to find a way to connect Arthur Delaney to this project in a manner that looked like natural professional logic rather than engineered charity. And the third of which was that he needed to do all of this without Arthur Delaney, knowing that Frank Sinatra had initiated it. The call to Capitol Records happened on a Wednesday morning, and the person Frank Sinatra spoke with was enthusiastic about the educational series concept, because Capitol was in the process of trying to expand its catalog into educational and archival content, and the idea of a jazz history series with Frank Sinatra's involvement attached had commercial logic that was self-evident, and Frank Sinatra said that he had someone in mind to serve as the series' primary musical consultant, someone with encyclopedic knowledge of jazz history and performance practice. And he named Arthur Delaney, and the Capitol executive said he didn't know the name, and Frank Sinatra said that was precisely the point, that the most knowledgeable people in the music industry were often the least famous because their knowledge had gone into making other people sound good rather than into promoting themselves. And the executive asked how he would contact Arthur Delaney, and Frank Sinatra gave him Arthur's address, which Frank Sinatra had obtained from a musician friend in Los Angeles, without explaining why he needed it. And the executive said he would reach out that week. Arthur Delaney received the letter from Capitol Records on a Friday and spent the weekend trying to understand it, because the letter described a project that sounded real and significant and offered compensation that was professional rather than charitable. And Arthur could not identify any reason why Capitol Records would know his name or consider him for such a project. And on the Monday, he called the number in the letter and spoke with the executive, who confirmed the project was genuine and who described what Arthur's role would involve, which was researching and scripting the musical history sections of a 12-part educational series, work that required exactly the knowledge Arthur had spent 15 years accumulating. And Arthur said he would think about it, and hung up and sat in his apartment with his muted trumpet on the shelf across the room, and thought about the fact that someone had found a way to need exactly what he had. The recording series took 18 months to produce, and Arthur Delaney worked on it with the same precision and musicality he had brought to his playing, and the scripts he wrote were subsequently described by music educators as models of clarity and depth, and the income from the project covered Arthur's expenses for nearly 2 years and gave him time to transition into a second career as a music educator, teaching at a community college in Los Angeles, where he remained for 16 years until his retirement. And when Arthur was interviewed by a music education journal in 1974 and asked about the Capitol Records project that had launched his second career, he said he had never fully understood how the project had found him, had always suspected that someone in the industry had pointed Capitol in his direction, but had never been able to determine who. And when the journalist pressed him, Arthur said that whoever it was had done something unusual and rare, had created an opportunity that looked like pure professional logic rather than like help, and that this was a much more difficult thing to accomplish than simply writing a check, and required someone who understood not just generosity but dignity. Frank Sinatra read Arthur's interview in his suite at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas when someone clipped it and sent it to him. And he read it twice and then folded it and put it in a drawer and never mentioned it to anyone, because the point had never been the recognition. The point had been the problem and the solution had worked. And the quiet satisfaction of a thing working the way it was supposed to work was its own sufficient reward for someone who understood that certain things were diminished by being named and enhanced by remaining silent. And the fog of San Francisco in December of 1959 had long since dissolved, and the problem that Frank Sinatra had stood on a Pacific Heights terrace turning over for 20 minutes with an unlit cigarette had been resolved not with a grand gesture, but with 2 telephone calls and the application of professional logic to a human situation, which was perhaps the most useful thing that power could ever be made to do. And Arthur Delaney taught music in Los Angeles for 16 years, and his students never knew about the trumpet on the shelf, or the hand that no longer worked, or the December in San Francisco, when someone decided that dignity was worth the extra effort required to preserve it.